Hey, all right. This is the fifth and, in fact, last lecture for Chapter 5. Just having the five again, they were all a little bit longer, so all cool. Okay, so I've told you before that I like to use these lectures to kind of sometimes discuss what was already discussed in the textbook, but often by trying to bring it to the bigger context of psychology and tie together those things you're learning in different chapters in various ways. And that's certainly going to be the case for this lecture. This lecture is on subliminal perception. So just before this lecture, I posted a video as well from a character, a YouTube celebrity, I guess, called Darren Brown. You could check out his videos more generally. They're fascinating. They really are. Darren Brown's video was meant to, when you watch that, meant to leave you going, what the heck is going on? And he's sort of demonstrating in there a kind of scary ability to use something called subliminal perception. He seems to be able to influence their thoughts and actions without them being aware that he's doing so. And that's always been a fascinating possibility that we've been kind of thinking about through the years. So there have been at times so-called subliminal perception tapes. You could go, at the time they were popular, they were actually cassette tapes. You could go into a bookstore and you could say, hey, I'd like to lose weight. And you could buy this tape that supposedly you listened to it. And when you listened, all you heard was like waves crashing or something very peaceful. But theoretically, underneath that all were messages to your subconscious mind. Messages like, sweet taste horrible. You don't like the taste of sweet anymore. Or, I don't know, high-fat foods always make you feel full and bloated, etc. And so the claim is your unconscious mind would start to embrace these messages. And then when you went out in the world and ate sweets or ate fats, you just wouldn't enjoy them anymore. And so you would naturally eat less. And so it was this sort of programming your subconscious mind to work for you. Sounds really cool if it works. Does it work? Okay, well, that's what we're talking about, subliminal perception. And I'm going to use this both to talk about that specific issue. Is there such a thing as subliminal perception? But I'm also going to show you how, such a challenging thing as what we've just talked about, the ability to influence somebody without their awareness. And in fact, just that general question, what is awareness for? What does it do? These are really tough, fuzzy feeling kind of questions. But I want to show you how you can now get to an experiment that actually tests theories about that. And that's what psychology is about. That's the challenge, is like trying to study things that are interesting, even if they're kind of big and fuzzy sort of concepts. Can you find ways to study them experimentally? So in fact, you're going to learn a lot about the research I did in my PhD, because just the little backstory to this, and I like to every now and then give a little backstory. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree, I was convinced by a professor at the University of New Brunswick. That's where I did my bachelor's. I was convinced by a professor that I should consider being a professor. He claimed I thought like a scientist, and he was very encouraging, and I took a lot of guidance from him. I'll say his name, Professor Wayne Donaldson. I think I owe him a lot. Because of him, I ended up applying to some universities. One of them I applied for was University of New Brunswick, but I didn't really want to stay there. I'd been there for a long time, and I'd also applied to UBC and Waterloo. UBC rejected me quickly. Ugh. UNB accepted me, but I didn't really want to stay at UNB. I wanted to go somewhere else. And then after a while, Waterloo rejected me. Now, I have a moral of this story for you. Anytime you're rejected, let's say for a job that you interviewed for, or some position you'd want, like this one for me, a graduate student kind of position, we're very tempted at that point in time to just walk away, with our tail between our legs. We're defeated. We just want to get away from that situation that we didn't win. It feels like we lost. Always remember Nelson Mandela's phrase. I love this phrase. He said, "I never lose. I either win or learn." What that says is, hey, if you didn't win, you'd better learn if you want to get something out of it. And so I think I had a little bit of that mindset, and I very honestly approached University of Waterloo because I really wanted to go to University of Waterloo. And I approached them and I said, okay, I didn't get in, and that's a bummer. I was kind of thinking I was going to get in. I was kind of hoping for that, but obviously I must have done something wrong in my application. And I know you formally looked at these applications and you formally made decisions about who to accept and not. Is there any chance I could speak to somebody involved in that process and that I could learn what I could have done differently, what I could have done better? Because I still want to go to graduate school, and I guess it might be next year if I want to go to a place like your institution, but I want to be able to submit a better application. Okay, so this is something I highly recommend. Anytime you've been formally assessed and you lose, go back to that place and ask for some information. Ask for the opportunity to learn and grow. That does two things. Often they will just say, okay, sure, we'll try to give you some information, and it kind of ends there. But the information that you get, you can use to do better next time. That's great. But you're also signaling something to those people. You're signaling that you are the sort of person that wants to continually learn and grow. That's the kind of person everybody wants in their organization. And so when I came back to them like that, they connected me with some people, and ultimately I got a call from this guy named Phil Miracle. And Phil said to me, I'll tell you why you didn't get in. One of your parts of your application, you were asked to propose an experiment. And you proposed a sports psychology experiment, and it was obvious to all of us that you'd put a lot of thought into it. It was a really great experiment, and our assumption was that's what you really want to do. None of us do that kind of research here, so we assumed you would be better off in another institution where you could work with an expert on sports psychology. I said, oh, shoot. I mean, I like lots of things. I'm not tied to the sports psychology thing that I do. I was just trying to impress you guys all with my ability to talk like a scientist and propose a scientific idea. And he said, well, you'd be potentially open to other things. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, okay, let me send you some papers, and then I'm going to call you back and we're going to talk about them. And so Phil did research on subliminal perception, and he sent me some papers. I read them, we talked, and he eventually said, you know what? You can come to Waterloo. I will supervise you. So that was a case where, doing that thing, reaching out to get information to help me grow, actually turned a loss into a win. It won't always do that, but it's always a good idea to do it anyway, to get that information. Okay, so what you're going to hear about in the research is some of what turned out to be my PhD. Okay, but let's get there slowly. All right. So this is where a lot of the story of subliminal perception begins. People started trying to understand, so we've talked about this a little bit, we have these sensory systems that get input from the external world. I've already told you that they don't get all of the external world. They're only sensitive to a small band. And so one of the questions is, well, how sensitive are they even within that band? So for example, if we had some source of light out there and we varied it from completely off to, making it brighter and brighter and brighter and brighter, how bright does it have to be before we can actually see it? Okay? Or how loud must a sound be before we can hear it? Or how strong must some touch be until we can feel it? We're asking about the sensitivity of our sensory systems. And people have started to investigate that. I told you about Weber's research, right? Where he was looking at how different two things had to be before somebody could detect a difference. He called that a just noticeable difference. This is like this, but the difference is between nothing and something. Like, how much stimulation do you need before you can detect that there's something even there? Okay, so when people do that research, they were looking at that. So they were presenting, let's say, visual things. They were presenting lights of different brightness, and they were asking people if they saw them or not. And that led to this sort of way of talking about things. So if we imagine, I'm just going to use this vague term, stimulus energy. But if you want, you can think of this as the brightness of a light or the loudness of a sound. And we can go from, it's not on at all, or there's nothing, up to where there's, a really bright light or a really loud sound. and we can vary that stimulus energy. And we can ask people, yeah, hey, can you see that light? Do you see it? Do you see anything or not? Say yes or no. And if we really want to be smart about this, by the way, we'll only present a stimuli on half the trials. So half of them will have nothing, half of them will have something. And therefore, the participants know that. They know that sometimes you're not showing. Otherwise, they always say, yeah, it must be out there. Yeah, it must be out there. And so now we can really focus and say, okay, when we do show it, well, this is an important line. We talk about their Lyman, which we're going to connect with this point of subjective awareness. Let me come back to that, though. The Lyman is the level of stimulus energy where you can detect the occurrence of the stimulus 50% of the time. So we want to find that point where it's just barely detectable. And how do we define just barely detectable? We say, well, half the time you see it and half the time you don't. That's right at that Lyman, okay? We also will sometimes call this a threshold, the absolute threshold. How much energy before it goes from something you can't see to something you can. Like a threshold is like a door. You go through into a different state. So how much energy does a stimulus need before it goes from something we're not aware of to something we are? And that's how we define that, 50%. And when we're talking about subliminal perception now, it's subliminal. So we would compare it to superliminal. Sub means below the Lyman. Super means above the Lyman. So once we know the Lyman, once we know that, imagine how fast we present a stimulus. Once we know that, okay, if we do it like real fast, 1 millisecond, they won't see it. 2 milliseconds, they won't see it. By the way, about how many milliseconds before you can see a stimulus? Seems to be somewhere around 50 before you can consciously see it. So if it's 10, 20, 30, people aren't seeing it. When we get around 50 milliseconds of presenting it and then taking it away, people now are see it about half the time. Okay, and so that's sort of the Lyman. And now the question is, if we present something below that, so less than 50 milliseconds, what happens to it? Does it get into the brain? Is there a line where it gets into the brain but we're not aware of it, and then another line where we become aware of it? Or does it have no effect on us until we become aware of it? These become interesting questions people were starting to deal with when they were thinking about sensory systems, right? So we want to find a point somewhere here where people are saying, I'm aware of it. I can see it now, this point of subjective awareness. Now, notice the term subjective. Again, I want to keep tying together these terms you're learning. Subjective, we have to ask them, right? We don't know if they're aware of it or not. We have to ask them. So it's back to sort of like a Wundt introspection. We're relying on the participant to say, yep, I see it. No, I don't see it. So it's a measure of subjective awareness, right? So we try to find that, and usually we'll use the Lyman as a way of doing that. And then we want to say, hey, I just noticed this said stimulus. I'm supposed to say stimulus. Anyway, then we can try to do some experiments to ask that, to test that question we just threw out there. Can you perceive something without awareness? What does that mean? Just walk through it, perceive it. Can it get into your mind without you being aware of the source of that? Let me just tie this back to the, just before we leave, to the Darren, I've lost Darren's last name. But at any rate, with those ad executives, the idea is those ideas came into their mind, right? And they thought it came from them. They didn't realize those ideas came from what they saw on the trip to that event, that it was the outside world. So they were unaware of the source of what came into their mind. So that's what we would call perception without awareness, right? So they ended up perceiving those things that they were in their minds, but they weren't aware of what put them in there, the actual stimuli that got them in. Okay. Right. So does subliminal perception occur? All right. So now let's go to my PhD. And now, what I want to say is, how do we go from a big question like that to trying to being able to answer it with an experimental approach? And so we need to start here by talking about the Stroop Effect. Now, this is another thing I like to do in classes, but that's harder to do online. So I'm going to have to ask you to do it with other people if you want to really check it out. Every Stroop Effect, and if you go into Google Images and do Stroop, you'll see all sorts of things like this that you can use. What is this? Well, these are Stroop stimuli, and they're always broken down into what are called congruent versus incongruent. The top ones here are the congruent. What do we mean by congruent? We mean that the word and the color it's written in are the same. So this is blue and blue, yellow and yellow, red and red, purple and purple, black and black. Okay. These ones are incongruent. The color is different from the word. The word blue and yellow, the word yellow and red, the word red and blue, the word purple and green, and the word black and purple. Okay, now, if you can get some of these, now here's the fun thing. This is the task you ask people to do. You first show them, it doesn't matter which one you start with, you can pick either one, but show them a list that's either just congruent or just incongruent. And then here's their task. Tell me as fast as you can what color the ink is. So if they were reading this, the right thing for them to do would be blue, yellow, red, purple, black. Yellow, red, blue, green, purple. You might have already noticed me stumbling a little more on this. So what you will find is that people will find this condition much harder. The incongruent. The congruent, they can go real fast. The incongruent, they go slow and they get a little choppy. Why? Well, because we've read words so often from such a young time that we now read words automatically. As soon as those letters are in front of us, our brain reads the word. And so when this goes in front of us, our brain reads it, and the name blue is in our head. Oh, but that's a problem because we're supposed to be responding to the color, and that's yellow. So now we were supposed to say yellow, but the word blue comes to mind, and now we have to fight them off, right? We have to push back the blue and say, no, I have to say yellow. And then we get to this one, I'm trying to say red, but the word yellow is putting yellow into my mind, and I have to battle that, okay? So that's the basic Stroop effect. That's where everything starts in this experiment. People are slower to read incongruent than congruent because the incongruence... the word produces a competing response. That's one way we would say it, right? Whereas here, the word and the color are the same. So even if you read the word, it's just going to bring you to that same response. But here it's going to bring you to a different one. And therefore, you have to resolve that competition to read the right color. Okay? Here's a website where you can go and try it yourself. So give that one a go. Okay, so now that we have the Stroop effect, and this is going to be a little complex because remember I tell you when you do experiments in psychology, you got to be clever. And often the experiments get a little complicated, but they can be really cool. So let me walk you through the experimental procedure. This is showing you one trial. There would be a bunch of trials of this sort. So here's how it worked. So your task is to categorize the color of the final rectangle. So what you're going to see, you're not, but what participants saw was a cross. They were supposed to stare right there. Then that would be replaced by a word. And the word would either be red or green. Those were the only two words we ever used. Okay. Very shortly after. So the word would be presented for a short period of time. Remember I told you 50 milliseconds? That's where you're not really aware of it yet. 200 you clearly are. This is right around the Lyman, a little below. You just have to trust me on that. So we're going to present this word either quickly or for a longer period of time, and then we're just going to cover it up with a bunch of this. This is not a swear word. This is what we call a visual mask. It's just when we cover up this with that, it makes that harder to see. Okay, so all we have is that 50 milliseconds or the 200, and then it gets replaced with this. So we literally say we're masking it. And then finally, there's a patch. Now, you as a participant are told your task is just to say what color this is, and it will always be either red or green. So participants had their fingers on a button, one button for red, one button for green. They would watch this stuff happen, boom, 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 and then this would come up, and they would say green, boom, 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 and then a patch would come up, and they would say the color, okay? But they were told one additional thing. They were told, you know that word that's going to come, you're responding to the patch, not the word. But we're gonna tell you something. That word usually is the opposite of the patch that you're going to see. So just like presented here, if the patch is green, usually this word will be red 80% of the time. If this patch is red, usually this word will be green 80% of the time. Okay. Why is that important? It now allows us to use the information about this word to make predictions about the patch before it comes. So especially when we can see that word for a longer period of time. So we saw the word red. Now we say, oh, that was the word red. The patch is probably going to be green. And this happens and then it's green. And we're ready. We expected it to be green, right? But if this is the word green, we're expecting it to be red. So we can use what's called a strategy here now. We can start to use the information from the prime. I'm going to call this the prime, that first word, to predict the color of the patch. But of course, you can only do that if you can see this, right? Because you're expecting the opposite. So you have to see it's the word green to expect red, and you have to see it's the word red to expect green. I don't know if you're still with me, but let's go to the next step and let's see if I can make this all make sense with you. Here's the data. Let's not worry about the subliminal for now. I should have just covered that right up. In fact, you know what? Just because this is what I want for now. I don't want us thinking about this one for now. So let's just do this. There we are. So let's not worry about that. This is the supraliminal. What do I mean by supraliminal? This is the 200 millisecond presentation of the word. So when people can see that word, red or green, this is what you see in terms of their reaction time. I should have also said reaction time here. But they're faster on the incongruent than the congruent. I told you people are usually faster on the congruent, but this is a weird case, right? Because we have them expecting the opposite. And if they can see that first thing, if they see what it is, what this suggests is they do expect the opposite. So if it's the word red and then it's a green patch, they're quick. Or if it's the word green and then it's a red patch, they're quick. That's this bar. But if it's the word green and then it's a green patch, or the word red and it's a red patch, so congruent trials, now they're slow because they were expecting the opposite, right? They were expecting it to be the opposite, and then, oh, it's not the opposite, it's the same thing, and so they're slow. Okay, so this seems to be evidence of them using this conscious strategy. And now the interesting question becomes the following. What if we now present that prime, that color word, so quickly that people cannot perceive it consciously, right? We know that 50 milliseconds from other studies and stuff, we know people say they don't see that when we present it. What happens then? Okay, this is what happens. The reverse of that. What is this? This is actually that standard Stroop effect I told you about in the first place. They're faster on congruent than incongruent. So if the word is green, they're fast when it's a green patch. When the word is red, they're fast when it's a red patch. But if the word is green and then it's a red patch, they're slow. Or if the word is red and it's a green patch, they're slow. Okay, it's the reverse of this. So first of all, it seems like they're not using the strategy. They can't, right? That item is presented so briefly, you can't expect the opposite of something unless you know what that thing was. So if you don't know if it said green or red because it went so fast, you can't expect the opposite. Okay. So that says, okay, they're not behaving like they do when they're aware. But now what's happening? Is that stimulus getting in at all? Well, yes, it is, because we are seeing an effect of the stimulus. We are seeing that when that word matches the patch, they're faster than when it doesn't. So it's too fast for them to use a conscious strategy, but the word is still getting in. When we see this, what we call a qualitative difference, completely different pattern below the Lyman and above, that makes us believe that, yes, this notion of perception without awareness is accurate. It happens. So the idea here is, even though you don't think you saw the word green or red, it got into your mind and it made you ready as long as that next thing matched it. The sort of natural Stroop effect. And so that word was still being processed. It was still getting in, even though you were not aware of it. This is not nearly as dramatic or as sexy as Darren's demonstrations, but this is how you show things in a lab, right? And so what are we getting at here? Well, we're getting at the role and function of consciousness. We're getting at what, it seems like, even without awareness, our brain can receive and respond to stimuli. But when we're aware of it, it seems now that other options are available, like the use of strategies. So we can start to ask, well, what is awareness of the stimulus allowing? What when we become aware of it, what are the extra things we can do in terms of having some conscious control over our behavior? So it really gets at the question of, what is consciousness for? That's a big fuzzy question. But with experiments like this, you can start to kind of get at questions like that. And I just want to, this is more foreshadowing. We're going to have a whole chapter on consciousness. So this is just giving you a taste. But I also want to just foreshadow you on this part a little bit. You guys have probably heard psychologists talking about conscious and unconscious, but you've probably heard the Freudian kind of view of this. And Freud's unconscious is very intelligent. It's almost like a little critter of itself. So the idea in Freud's world is we have all these unconscious processes that do things like decide what gets into our conscious awareness. If something is too troubling, too difficult for us to think about, there may be unconscious processes that prevent that thing from ever getting into consciousness. And I think we've talked about some of that a little bit. And so it's like the unconscious processes are intelligent and deciding what to do and how to do things. That's the sort of Freudian view. Most psychologists do not accept that notion of the unconscious, and instead they connect the unconscious more with habit, more with, like in the case of the words we just talked about, why does presenting the word green make you ready for a green patch? Well, because your mind automatically reads it and produces the sound. That's what we call reading, right? Put a set of letters in front of us, and the sort of sound related to those letters comes to mind automatically. There's nothing sneaky going on. It's not whatever. It's just habit. And so that unconscious processes reflect sort of instinctual responses, reflexive responses, habitual responses to things, whereas the conscious mind reflects more goal-oriented approaches. So something where we're trying to solve some problem or reach some goal. We're going to talk about this distinction between conscious and unconscious more. Really what I want you aware of from this point, I wanted to use this lecture to say, even tough things like that, you can create lab experiments that try to get at, what is the role of consciousness and how is it having its play. And I also just want you to, kind of ahead of time know that this topic is one of a lot of interest. We have a whole chapter on this coming up. And so there's more to the conscious-unconscious issue than what you may have learned in the Freudian sense. And by the end of this course, I think you'll have a really good sense of how most current psychologists think of how the mind uses conscious and unconscious processes to determine our behavior. It's kind of a cool topic. Okay. Excellent. So I think I'm going to leave it there for Chapter 5. I think those lectures, with all that you've had to read and go through, give you plenty to work on. I hope at this point in the course, you're starting to see how some of these things we talk about are all kind of coming together, right from the history of psychology to other things. And we're going to continue to build on this as we go through the next 4 chapters. So this is kind of halftime in the course. We're going to have the midterm shortly after that on what we've talked about so far, and then we're going to continue on in the second half of the course. So I will certainly be waiting for you in Chapter 6. Alrighty, thanks. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.